I'd like to welcome everyone to the 2014 SU Research Day and Innovation Showcase. I'm Clifton Griffin, Dean of Grad Studies and Research. First and foremost, thank all of you for being here. In particular, I'd like to thank our Provost, Dr. Allen, sitting back here for her support for this event and for research and scholarship overall. This day is about creating connections. Those connections are important, whether it's faculty member to faculty member right here on campus, or it's creating connections between our campus and the outside community. That's what we hope will be the takeaway message from your presentations today. As you can tell from the program, we have a wide array of topics. It's going to be fascinating. I can't wait. I've already had a little bit of a snippet of almost all of the presentations, and I can tell you, you will be wowed. Also awesome to see some of last year's presenters who are here supporting folks from this year. We certainly appreciate their participation and their being here. For our next talk, we have Joyce Wiencek, Reading and Writing with Piper, Pathways to Success. Joyce.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here. You're probably wondering why I would choose to focus on one child and focus on his ability to learn to read and write. Piper was a young man that I met through the May Literacy Center here at SU. And Piper came many times to our tutoring sessions, and he was honestly the first child I'd ever encountered that we weren't what I considered successful with. So when SU offered me the opportunity to take a sabbatical, I took that time to work with Piper. So I want to tell you first a little bit about Piper. Okay. His problem was he was having a terrible time learning to read. Piper was in 4th grade at that point. He was 10 years old. He's a Caucasian male. He attends a local private school and had been identified early on as a child with developmental delays. He also, later on during the study, was diagnosed as mildly autistic. Piper wanted to learn how to read, and we weren't having success. And after all my years in public schools and working in the profession of reading, I wanted to help Piper succeed. So he was basically having tremendous difficulty retaining basic sight words in memory. Okay, so words like on and could and should, he had a terrible time with. He just couldn't hang on to them. He read at a pre-primer level, which is really the basic, very first grade kindergarten level. And he processed information slowly. And writing was something he definitely did not like to do, and which many people out there in the field suggest children with some handicaps don't even try writing with them. And it had been suggested to his parents and through the IEP accommodations that writing was something we shouldn't do. But he wanted to read, and I was determined that I could help him. So I took my sabbatical time, and I committed to meeting with Piper on a daily basis for 45 minutes at his private school to tutor him in reading. And his school was more than willing to allow me to do this, and they welcomed the help. So one of the first things I said to myself was, how can I help Piper? Here's a young man that, as far as I could see, we'd used all the basic tools that are well known in the field of reading. And yet it didn't seem to stick. He'd make some progress, and then he'd fall back every summer and come back to school at the beginning again. And that wasn't good. So I basically sort of built myself a chart, all the different things I could try with him. I did some basic assessment, which, as I said earlier, identified him as reading at a pre-primer level, basically not knowing many words. Okay? So here were some tools I could use, but that wasn't just enough for me. I had to keep thinking about this. One of the first things I said to myself is, I'm not going to be focused on labels, because in the field of reading and special ed, people tend to say, well, he's autistic, he's dyslexic, he's this. If I'd ever met a child and I had the ability to identify a child as dyslexic, I would have identified Piper in that way. But the local school districts do not identify children with that label. And would the label really help me? Probably not. So I thought, well, I need to try some new approaches, but I also don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I want to use some tried and true approaches. And I thought I wanted to try technology. So I did. And what basically happened is, as I began to work with Piper on a daily basis, he didn't like to write. But yet I know some children do learn to read by writing. So I started to engage him in writing. And the very first writing that I did with Piper was honest and truly just him copying a sentence, because he'd had very minor expectations of writing put on him. So his first sentence for me was, "In go some gumballs," simply copying it. But we quickly moved away from that, because every single day the journal would come out as part of our 45-minute session, along with reading, and I would model for him. Well, let's see, what happened in my life yesterday? And then I'd share a story, and then I'd say, so tell me something that happened in your life yesterday. And he suddenly discovered he did have things to write about. So for example, one of his early entries was, pigs are my favorite farm animal. Now he couldn't write that sentence completely on his own, but with help, with scaffolding, for example, the word favorite, he sat there and he's like, I can't do that. So I put dashes for every letter, and we slowly sounded the word out, and he discovered he could pretty much spell the word completely. Well, that was one of the things that I really learned very quickly through the writing portion of our daily work, was that he had a visual memory of a lot of words. Words that if I gave him on a list in isolation, he couldn't read, but ask him to produce the word would, and he could write it. So I was convinced he had a visual memory of words, and I had to find a way to strengthen those connections. And so that's why we began to write every day. Now that may not seem like rocket science to you, but in an era where schools are taking ideas and throwing some out and putting new ones in, the emphasis on writing went right out the door. Many children learn to read by writing. So, even though he didn't like it, he did it. So the change came slowly but steadily. And what did I notice? His word recognition really strengthened. So in other words, one of the things we want in reading is within a 1-second time period, we want you to be able to recognize a word. He started to be able to do that. His willingness to write improved, and the amount that he would write every day improved. Okay? And what happened over the course of 5 short months is his reading capacity grew from pre-primer to late second, early third grade in just 5 short months of daily tutoring. But then I was concerned, because what's going to happen over the summer? He'd been known to make progress and then fall back over the summer. Would it continue? What would happen? So I decided that I would also commit in June and August to tutor him 3 times a week, following the same basic format. And then his family was going away on a trip to Florida for a whole month. And his mother came to me and she said, but how are we going to make sure he doesn't lose all the progress he's made? And I said, well, they were a very supportive family. They are a very supportive family. And they read with Piper every single day. And they'd have him read the little bits that he could. And then they continued reading. So he had a wonderful listening comprehension. I said, you need to keep doing the reading every day, but the thing that you need to do is take a journal. And I gave him a journal. And I said, I want Piper to write every single day that he's away, so that when we come back in August, I can see what he's done. And he wrote every single day. I challenged him to write 3 sentences every day. So for example, on July 6th, he wrote, I'm going to ride on the new tube. I'm going on the boat. I went to Assateague Beach. And a few weeks later, we get things like, I went to the Selvin store. I went to a big McDonald's. So his writing continued. What happened when he came back in August? He'd held on to all the growth that he made during those 5 months when I worked with him. He didn't go back to the pre-primer level. He was still at a 3rd grade level. So I made the commitment the following year to work with him every single day. I continued to do it, and he's now reading at a high 4th grade level. What this said to me is that there are a lot of things we need to consider. You should use lots of tools, because I did lots of things besides write with him. Almost every technique on that earlier chart I used. But don't let folk wisdom influence your decisions. There are a lot of children out there where teachers are saying, you don't have to write, we'll make an accommodation for you. I think we're actually harming some children because connections aren't being made. And we see other children like this come to the May Literacy Center, and we make sure to get them writing as well as reading. Be sure to observe, listen, and reflect on what the child tells you, and let those things inform your teaching. Believe me, there were days when I went home and I was like, am I really making any difference? In the beginning, one of the things I didn't tell you about was that I noticed that Piper had a lot of trouble transitioning from his regular class to coming in and settling down and being able to work with me. I read some research when I read widely that just took place in Italy in 2013. They discovered that with dyslexic teenagers, that when you put them on action video games for a sustained period of an hour for over 3 weeks, it made a difference in their processing time. So one of the things that I did with Piper as a result of that was that every single day for the first 2 months, when he was uptight and not settling in, I'd pull out the iPad, and initially I let him play word games. But after reading that article, I thought, well, let's try Angry Birds. And you know, over time, his ability to play Angry Birds increased prolifically, and I believe it shortened his processing time with reading. That's a topic I'd like to further pursue. So you really need to pay attention to what the child is telling you. And my attention to that fact that he couldn't settle in, I didn't want to lose that time. Lots of people say technology is the answer. I think it's a little piece of the answer, but I think having the support of someone who really knows reading is really essential. And then, what was my most important lesson? Ultimately, never give up on a child's ability to learn to read and write. This young man started coming to the May Literacy Center when he was like 6. And he never gave up on himself. And his family never gave up on him. And now he's finally experiencing success and holding his own in 6th grade. So I feel very fortunate that SU gave me that opportunity to take that sabbatical and to focus in on something that I love, and I try to instill that love in my students. So thank you.
Questions?
Sometimes you know, in my experience when I've worked with a child in a clinical setting or individual setting, that doesn't often translate into the classroom because they do it in a different way in the classroom and the child can't make that transition. So I'm wondering with Piper, did you work closely with the school to make that transition, or did you notice issues he had going from the individualized, real focused instruction to sitting in a classroom where it's all over?
Well, I was fortunate that his classroom teacher, particularly in fourth grade, well, he actually had the same one in fourth and fifth, was very interested in finding ways to help him. And so at least twice a week, we talked about what we were doing and what she was seeing. And there were times where she would actually say to me, he's really having difficulty with this in language arts or this that we're reading. Can you help him? But she really also at the same time valued the fact that she could see the change. And what she let me do, which I think was an integral part of his growth, was that she allowed, for example, when he did really well with a nonfiction text and wrote a whole list of things that he'd learned, she had him share it in front of everybody and made it a big deal. And the other thing was the children started to notice that his reading was getting stronger. So I think there was a fairly good connect. I mean, I still do worry about him that way, particularly as he moves up the grades. But the one thing that Piper had going that I think I failed to mention too was that Piper has a very strong background knowledge. His parents read extensively to him. And an interesting thing that I discovered was that he's much better with nonfiction text than he is with fiction, which kind of goes against conventional wisdom. And his teacher would play off the little things, the successes we had, and make sure that it was noticed by the children in the classroom. So he was an incredibly supportive environment and still is. Thank you.